Good afternoon, everyone. No, one more time. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. Y'all are so kind, so kind. So we're here to talk to you about racial inequity and homelessness, and wanted to start this conversation by framing it up with a quote that I stay up and think about a lot. And it's from Vincent Harding, who was a speechwriter for Martin Luther King Jr. And Vincent Harding once asked this question: is America possible? Is America, this nation, where diversity is our strength, still possible? I think about that a lot because of what you're about to hear, which is that it doesn't feel that way most of the time. Most of the time it feels like our idea of strength is monolithic and low-key one color. So how do we begin to change that? That's what we're going to talk about today.
I'd like to take you back with me about a year. Imagine that we're walking down the streets of a large unnamed city in the northeast of the United States, and we're walking through an area where people in fine business suits are going into law offices and accounting firms and financial institutions, and we walk past some very, very high-end, high-rise condominiums, and we turn the corner and see the entrance to the drop-in center that's there to provide a safe space for people experiencing homelessness. And we wind our way through masses of people out front, past Bo, the security guard, who has just administered Narcan to save someone's life from opiate overdose. And we go through the metal detectors and past security and into the big drop-in center main room, and we're surrounded by bodies, by hundreds of people who don't know where they're going to sleep tonight. They don't always know where their next meal is going to come from. And we very quickly notice that the vast majority of the people we're seeing are people of color. And we walk between and around and by all of those black and brown bodies, and we get into the elevator to go up to the 6th floor because our job, what we're there for, is to do some strategic planning with the leadership of this organization. Good leadership. It's a good organization. They provide great care. It's humane. It's trauma-informed. It's a good place. So we go into the conference room on the 6th floor, and we quickly realize that the faces around the table in the conference room don't quite look like the faces we just saw down on the 1st floor. What we see is a leadership team of 10 people, 9 whites and 1 African-American woman named Teresa. And we spend the next couple of hours doing some amazing visioning work about what they want this agency to be, what they imagine it to be 2 years from now, 5 years from now. And after a while, after maybe 90 minutes of this wonderful, sprawling conversation with flip chart papers stuck to the walls and great energy and ideas, Teresa says, I have a vision for this organization. I can imagine a day where the leadership and staff of this organization reflects the diversity of the people we serve. And everybody looks around and nods, yeah, oh yeah, that's great. And then she goes, and I ought not to be the one to have to say it.
Yeah.
So it turns out that that's not uncommon. And the reason it's not uncommon is that homelessness disproportionately impacts people of color at really startling rates. So black folks make up about 13% of the general population, but between 45 and 50% of people currently in shelter in America. And Jeff and I give this talk a lot, and one of the things that we hear all the time is, oh, well, it's poverty, and unfortunately, because of how America works, like, it's just people of color are more likely to be poor, so like and that's true. Black folks are more likely to be poor. However, we're only 27% of the poverty population. So if, in fact, it was poverty that was the underlying driver and just poverty alone, we would expect those numbers to match. But they do not. So we've had this conversation a lot in a lot of different places.
We rant and rave a lot in a lot of different places.
I do the raving.
I rant. Mostly. We like to think of it as delightful indignation.
So it was sometime after we spoke at the White House when people kept asking us what we were doing about it instead of just ranting and raving. And
we said, isn't that enough?
I felt like it was. I felt like it was sufficient to show up. And so we launched an initiative called SPARK, which stands for Supporting Partnerships for Anti-Racist Communities. The function of SPARK is to do one central thing: figure out why this happens. And to that end, because Jeff and I firmly believe that if you just ask people what's happened to them, they will tell you, and also I'm an anthropologist, we decided that there would be a large qualitative arm to our study. We've launched SPARK in 5 cities and collected over 125 oral histories from people of color experiencing homelessness, and used those to create the first real map of what's happening to people as they slide into homelessness.
What we found is in large part what we've already known. As Marc described, we've had all of these amazing interviews. We've also looked at tens of thousands of pieces of data from homeless management information systems. We've documented the proportionality of people of color experiencing homelessness. What we've also begun to do is map the systems that drive people into homelessness. And the first system that we keep hearing over and over in these oral histories is multi-generational involvement in the child welfare system. And what we believe is that the child welfare system behaves differently in communities of color than it does in white suburban communities. So while there might be one tentacle of the welfare system going into white communities that's really focused on family reunification, what we see is many tentacles that are much more along the lines of foster care and child removal and long-term involvement in the system for communities of color. And we see that play out in generation after generation of poor black and brown children who end up homeless. The second system that we began really trying to unpack is the housing system. And we know that housing, affordable housing, decent housing, housing is a human right, is the fundamental solution to homelessness. We also know that housing has not equally treated all communities in the United States. And if you look at policies like the longstanding policy of redlining, which was the process by which communities of color were literally drawn out in a map and turned red, and mortgages were not given to people living in those communities. What happened as a result is that wealth accumulation happened in the green areas and deep poverty happened in the red areas. And if you look at this map of Boston, what you see even today is the red areas are densely populated by people of color, and the green areas are populated in large part by white folks.
I'm gonna play a game. I'm a fine, upstanding black person. I've spoken at the White House. Where do I live? This is where I live. I live in that great big red area. Where does Jeff live?
I live in the green area.
Shocking.
This still plays out even today. And it plays out in community after community. It's not a northern issue, it's not a southern issue, it's not a big city issue, it's not a small town issue, it's everywhere. This is our history, and this drives contemporary homelessness. The next system that we began to unpack was the criminal justice system and the relationship between mass incarceration of communities of color and pathways into homelessness. And what we've seen is that communities of color experience people being disappeared from those communities, as if they're being abducted by aliens. They're gone. The fathers are gone, the brothers are gone, and those communities are left in tatters, not just because of that, but because of the economic issues, because of the lack of all the other investments that have been missing from communities of color for decade after decade after decade. And there's a direct pathway from criminal justice into homelessness. We don't do a good job at preventing homelessness at the point of reentry.
The other thing we heard a lot about was health, which is, the thing everyone wants to talk about these days, so we figured we'd include it here too. The thing that we hear when we talk about health, though, is chronic illness. So it turns out in this country, we devote the vast majority of our healthcare budget to building access to acute care. We actually have a hugely underfunded chronic care system, and it turns out that folks of color don't have great access to that. So a story that I heard a lot was, oh, I hurt myself, right? I remember one woman said to me, I had an enlarged kidney and I couldn't get care for it until I was bedridden for 2 months, and so I lost my job. That's how this all started for me. The other thing that we continued to hear about was employment. Again, I'm sure this surprises no one, but it turns out that black folks don't get hired at the point of the resume, right? We've all seen the studies that look at whether or not a resume comes in with an ethnic-sounding name or not, with the same skills, the same job history. That ethnic-sounding name is going to wind up in a different pile. What we heard from our respondents over and over and over again was not that they couldn't get employment. It was that they couldn't get employment that would pay enough for them to stay housed. What was missing was not an opportunity for a job, it was the opportunity for a career. Those are different things. So, what, right? We ran around, we collected all these oral histories to come and tell you some stuff that we already knew. Not quite. We also heard something new. And this new thing we're calling network impoverishment. And it built off a lot of research that's out there already around social capital. But what's new about this is that we found that for folks of color who were sliding into homelessness, we started to hear a story over and over and over again about there being just quite not enough capital in their network. We started to hear something like this.
I have family down here.
I have friends.
But then at the same time, I don't. So it's not like when I leave here, I can go
Staying the night is out of the
to a
question.
family member's
They like
house.
2 kids, and their father was living inside his mother's house, which she owns the house, and then she wasn't like able to take care of it like how she used to, and like things started getting cut off slowly, like the water, the gas, the electricity. We started having no food, and then like she left, and then we didn't have nowhere to go, so we just stayed. And then after that, it started to get cold outside, so we just like, let's just go to the shelter.
Basically, I'm homeless.
So now I'm back here in this shelter. I didn't have nowhere to live in the house.
So this raises the question, what do we do about it? What can we do about it? We believe so deeply that this problem can be solved. You know, we talk a lot at conferences like this about how systems need repair, about how systems need improvement, about how systems are broken. And I've come to believe that the systems are not broken. The systems are behaving exactly like they were designed to behave. And they were designed to exclude communities of color. They were designed to exclude people experiencing poverty. If we built that machine, we can tear down that machine. We can build a different machine. And there are a number of things we can do. As we said earlier, we've been accused of ranting and raving. We've been accused of not offering solutions. We bring you solutions. One thing that we can do is to continue to bear witness to this issue. We can continue to bear witness to the fact that homelessness is not an equal opportunity offender, that it offends people of color much more often, much more commonly than it does white people. The other thing that we can do is focus on local solutions. I know it's easy to be overwhelmed by the national political scene. It's easy to be overwhelmed by our seeming inability to make change happen at a large scale. Focus on your own neighborhood. Focus on your own agency, your own community, your own friends and family. Make change start there. The other thing that we can do is begin to redesign our systems. Many of you are in positions of power and authority to redesign those systems, to try new things, to create change. Even those of you who feel disempowered, you have a lot more power than you think you do to be a change agent in the world. So that brings us to the 6 steps that we can do to begin to end inequity in housing and homelessness in America.
So we broke this up into 2 parts, agency and community. And we did that because, having done this work for some time and having raved and or ranted, we found that what people would often do is take what we said and immediately jump to applying it to the world around them. They would not ever clean up their own backyard. So what we're going to stop right here and now is that practice. Because I'm going to tell you about what you can do in your house first before you mind your neighbors. The first thing you can focus on is diversity and inclusion at the staff level. That means that if you walk through the halls of your agency and almost everybody is white, you need to change your agency. all agencies, especially those that serve folks, should at least match the ratios of the population in the area that they're working. The next thing is career pathways for those folks. So you cannot just make all your receptionists black women and call that a day. That, it turns out, is not sufficient. Unless you are hiring folks of color who are able to advance to senior, if not the most senior position, you have not built an equitable and inclusive work environment. And finally, create positions that are tasked with creating that equity. Over and over and over again, what I see is a lot of commitment, a lot of energy, but it is always the third thing on the agenda, or it is the meeting that happens after 5 for the people who wanted to volunteer to do the thing because it's a good thing to do. That's not how we do this. Everybody who's ever run anything knows that nothing changes until you have skin in the game. That counts here too.
At the community level, there's a lot we can do also. We start with this notion of network impoverishment, and if we believe that to be a root cause of the large numbers of people of color experiencing homelessness, that's where the remedies begin. Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a beautiful article called The Case for Reparations. We have done so much historical damage to African Americans and to Native Americans in this country. It's about time we began making amends. One way to provide reparations is to invest heavily in communities of color that have been decimated by our economic system and our political choices. And if we can begin doing that, if we can begin rebuilding the economic capital and the economic opportunity in those neighborhoods and in those communities, things will begin to change. The next thing we can do is to ensure that the voice of people of color is present and loud at every table we are a part of. Remember back to Teresa's story. Remember the well-meaning white folks around the table. I was in a meeting yesterday with about 25 well-meaning white folks and no people of color. When you're in a meeting like that, don't have the meeting. If you have to have the meeting, have a different meeting. Don't make it the third thing on the agenda, make it the only thing on the agenda, and say, how can we assure, how can we ensure, how can we assure, how can we commit to amplifying the voice of people of color at this table and at every table we're a part of. Finally, how do we begin to create economic mobility? How do we begin training people with real skills that matter in the 21st century? How do we ensure that job opportunities and career pathways are available for all people of color in all communities in all parts of the United States?
So, started this by asking this question that Vincent Harding asked. No, this is you still.
The question is, what can we do right now?
Oh, yeah.
What can we do right now? One thing you can do today is to talk about this with someone. Take 10 minutes over dinner, when you're out for a walk, when you're calling a loved one later tonight. Tell them what you heard. Bear witness. What can you do over the next week? One thing you can do in the next week is look at every meeting that you're a part of through the lens of racial equity. And if there aren't people of color at the table, change the makeup of the table. Do an audit. Do an audit of every meeting, every group that you're a part of over the next 7 days and see what happens. Over the next 6 months, if you're in a position of authority, if you run an organization or an institution, if you run programs, if you control budgets, find the money to create an equity position, a senior level position who's going to drive change within your organization. If you're an executive director of a community-based organization, launch a community dialogue. Launch an internal dialogue followed by community conversations about racial inequity in mental health, in addiction treatment, in homelessness services. You all, every one of you, regardless of the color of your skin, regardless of your position, can be an agent for change. You can be a spearhead in your own communities. Now, to Vincent Harding.
I'm just really used to talking over Jeff. It just came really naturally to me. So we started this conversation, right, with Vincent Harding. And Vincent Harding also came to the conclusion that this America, right, where diversity is our strength, is still possible. That was the conclusion that he came to. I've come to a similar conclusion. I think that it is pretty late in the game to get started on it. But sometimes you start a project late in the semester and you knew you were supposed to work on it all term and you just kind of didn't because like people were cute and beer was there. But we can still get it done. And fundamentally, right, we have to get it done. We cannot continue to live in an America that says to people of color, that says to LGBTQ folks, you don't matter, you're not real. That's not the America we can allow to persist. The upshot is that I know America can change. And I know that because I'm standing on this stage not to be auctioned, but to tell you something. America has changed before, and it can change again. And you will change it. Thank you.